Okay, hello everyone, and welcome and thank you so much for coming to our webinar today. So we're going to be talking about the current state of research relating to autism and bilingualism. We really hope you find this event informative and interesting and ask us as many questions as you want. So my name is Rachel Davis and I'm going to be hosting the event. I'm a research fellow at the University of Edinburgh. I'm a developmental psychologist and my current research focuses on understanding the interplay of autism, bilingualism, cognition and cultural identity. So I'll be introducing the presenters and panelists today as we go along, but to let you know in advance, we'll be hearing about the work of Shireen Sharan, Drasko Kashtalan, Beranger Degar, and we'll be hearing later from Sunny Hallett. Now, you should hopefully see a question box that you can use throughout the event. Please do ask as many questions as you like during any of the talks. I'll be keeping an eye on the responses, and at the end of each talk, we can have some time to go through kind of as many questions as we can. And as well, we'll have some kind of general questions for the panel discussion at the end. So the questions can be upvoted. So if there's something you think is particularly interesting that you want to hear about, if you click on the thumbs up next to the question, then we can try and prioritize those questions. The questions are moderated, so don't worry if you don't see your questions straight away. The webinar is being recorded and will be made available on the Patrick Ward Centre website later on, which we'll have the link to. The recordings will be subtitled and there will be transcripts available as well. So I think that's all of the admin. And now to introduce our first speaker. So first up, we have Dr. Shireen Sharan. Shireen recently finished her PhD in psychology at the University of Edinburgh, and she was researching executive skills in bilingual autistic children in the United Arab Emirates. Her research stands out in the field because while most studies are run in Western countries, her research focuses on children in an Arabic country. And she's also been involved in the field of autism for 10 years as a support worker as well. So like I said, please do ask as many questions as you like in the chat, and we'll have some time at the end of her talk to go through some of those questions as well. So I will put her on the screen. Now, over to you, Shireen. Oh, I think you're muted, Shireen.
Right, here we are. Is that better now? Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone. Welcome to this very rare and special platform dedicated to research on bilingualism and on autism. I am going to attempt to pull in the evidence for you and try to answer a big question: how does bilingualism impact cognition in childhood autism? So to begin with, I'm going to briefly introduce the aspects of cognition that the research has focused on, and then take you to the interface of bilingualism and autism and cognition. I'm then going to dive into the evidence. You know, what does it say as far as executive function is concerned? What does it say as far as social cognition is concerned? And then how do these findings influence what we know about autism? Finally, I'm going to be drawing conclusions together for you. Cognition. So this is actually what I am focusing on, executive function. You can also think of this as thinking skills, learning skills. So it's a set of really important skills that we use on a day-to-day basis to complete goals, to basically get things done. And I'm going to hone in on 4 key executive function skills that the literature has focused on, beginning with working memory. And that's pretty much about keeping new information in mind. So you can think about it as like a mental sticky note. There's also sustained attention, you know, your ability to focus over a period of time, like, you know, you're going to be focusing over a period of time during this talk and during the following talks. The third one is interference control, and that talks about, you know, how well can you resist distractions while you're attending to a particular task, for example. And finally, flexible switching, your ability to switch your thinking from one concept or from one task to another. A good example of using all 4 at once is learning how to drive, all 4 at the same time. Now, executive functions have been shown to predict social skills, academic achievement, mental and physical health, quality of life, and even staying out of jail. Social cognition is the second aspect of cognition that we're going to be focusing on. And so that's mainly about the processes that enable us to, interpret social information and allowing us to thrive in social environments. I'm going to hone in on three: communicative gestures. And so basically it's things like this, like I'm doing with my hand, symbolizing movements that are helping us communicate. It's been shown to predict language ability in, later years, as well as social skills. Pragmatic language is using language in a specific situation to enrich that particular communication. So it's basically like what you say, how you say it, when you say it, being appropriate in social the contexts. And finally, theory of mind, the ability to reflect on your own and other people's mental states, being able to maybe kind of understand what people are thinking or feeling. And social cognition is a strong predictor of quality of life. So these are the two aspects of cognition. We now move on to the interface now of bilingualism, autism, and cognition. So as far as these two aspects of cognition are concerned, we know from the research that these are two areas that could be potentially challenged by the autism. At the same time, we know that these areas could be potentially extended by the bilingual experience. Ultimately, rates of diagnosis of autism are on the rise, and so is the worldwide bilingual population. And so it becomes more and more imperative to chart the impact of bilingualism on these specific the functions, especially so because we have growing concerns from parents, practitioners, educators about raising autistic children with two languages. So that's exactly what a few studies have attempted to do these past few years. This is a relatively new wave of research. And so now we find out, so does bilingualism harm these skills? Does it improve these skills, or does it make no difference to it whatsoever? Let's find out. So I'm going to start with executive function. And I'm going to say that the most consistent finding across the literature is that bilingualism does not negatively impact the executive functions of autistic children. This has been evidenced using different measures. So there are three main types of measures here. There is directly assessed executive function. So that will mainly look like, maybe computerized tasks that we give to children. So we schedule an appointment, they come in, they take these tasks or these games on the computer, and basically it captures their executive function performance at one point in time. So if I give you a task for like 20 minutes, that's your executive function for the next 20 minutes. So it captures state-like executive function capacities in a specific type of environment, because it's just your performance at one point. It captures your state at that point in time. So about 5 studies have looked at this topic using direct assessments. We then move on to parent assess the measures. So here parents will be filling out these questionnaires that will assess their children's executive function capacities. Now that is different because it captures their traits, because that is assessing a child's performance on a day-to-day capacity. So it's not at one point in time, it's more over a period of time, and that just brings out certain traits that direct assessments cannot necessarily capture. And so once again, these particular studies here have done just that. More recently, I added a teacher assessment. So in my research, so it still captures trait like executive function capacities, but this time it's in a school setting. So we have lab settings, home settings, school settings. I wouldn't say that there's a measure, one type of measure better than the other. They simply capture different parts of executive function. So a combination of all would be best. Again, this finding has been evidenced using different matching criteria. So I'm sure you know that, a lot of these studies have focused on more cognitively abled autistic children. So mainly, using children who meet typical like nonverbal IQ, but the studies that I've included here, they've actually taken on a more inclusive range. So they're also including children that have a range of IQ abilities, which is really, really important, particularly when you're studying or investigating with children with neurodevelopmental conditions. So this finding has held true even for children with varying IQ abilities. And also bilingualism markers, right? So because different studies have used different thresholds, like who is bilingual, right? It could be an early bilingual, later the bilingual, someone who's proficient, not so proficient. So different studies have used different thresholds here. I would say mainly early bilinguals were used. So kids, before the age of 8 who acquired both of their languages. But again, this finding has held true for people who have different proficiencies and different ages of language acquisition. And finally, the finding has held true across different geographical contexts. So psychological research and of course the autism research has mainly focused on Western populations, right? So it's less so with non-weird samples, so weird Western educated, industrialized, rich and democratic samples. So my research went beyond these samples because I collected data from the Arab world. So this finding has been evidenced using different measures, matching criteria and geographical contexts. The second finding is that bilingualism may even mitigate some of the difficulties that autistic children could face in this particular domain. This is a finding that's been evidenced using both direct assessments and more recently also parent reports. However, for most of these studies, only a single variable revealed a bilingual advantage out of 2 candidate outcome variables. So for example, if I'm measuring sustained attention and there are 3 outcome variables, one is about reaction time and the other 2 are something else, one of them has shown that advantage and the other 2 have just shown like there's no difference, between bilinguals and the monolinguals. So it's not really clear yet whether, like, to what extent are these effects robust. We do need replications with larger samples. We need to use multiple measures to assess each component of executive function. So for example, like if I want to measure sustained attention, let's use 2 tasks to measure that one component. And also a combination of measures, like I was saying, those in the lab and those with also some real life ecological validity, as well as longitudinal approaches. So this is what we need moving forward. Let's see about social cognition. So there's less of an overall body here, but again, the main finding, the most consistent, is that it does not negatively impact social cognition in autistic children. This has been evidence across the domains that we were talking about: gestures, pragmatic language, and theory of mind. The same studies have also, a couple of them have found even some advantages for autistic bilinguals. So for example, when it comes to the gestures, autistic bilinguals were seen to basically have increased frequency of gestures. And the same thing will hold true for theory of mind. Once again, we do need replications with larger, more diverse samples, using multiple measures of social cognition and a combination of both lab and real life measures coupled with longitudinal approaches. Now, how did these findings influence our understanding of autism? Well, this is probably the coolest part of the talk for me, because one of the key theories proposed to explain the characteristics of the autism is the executive dysfunction theory. So at the premise of this theory is that, autistic people have deficits in executive function. And when we look at the findings from all the studies that I've just shown you, when we compare groups of autistic people to their typically developing peers, when we average performance across autistic children, they do display poorer thinking skills as a group when you take the average of the whole group relative to their typically developing peers. This finding does support the executive dysfunction theory, that there are deficits across autistic people when compared to their typically developing peers. But if we change the way we analyze the data, so instead of comparing groups of autistic people to groups of typically developing people, instead of taking an average, if we look at the performance of each autistic individual, so we analyze the data one by one, the picture is different. When autistic children's executive function performance is analyzed on an individual level, most autistic children were shown to display equal performance to their typically developing peers. This finding does not support the executive dysfunction theory. So this is really interesting here because this was the part of the research that I had done. I had added beyond group level analysis, individual level analysis, also known as the multiple case series. So it seems that it is the individual experience of the autism that really shapes your capabilities in this domain, and possibly also across many other domains. So this means that the use of group level analysis by itself can actually lead to a very dangerously misleading picture of what the autism is, both in a theoretical and clinical sense. Well, moving forward, I just want to put together some conclusions from this talk. I'm going to start by saying that language decisions about autistic children, this is something, there's a lot at stake here. This can affect their cognitive development, their family and community relationships, their access to services, cultural identity, access to leisure, access to education, and access to employment opportunities, just like their typically developing peers. So there's a lot at stake here when we're talking about language decisions about autistic children. Contrary to widespread concerns and notions, being autistic and bilingual is not associated with disadvantages in both executive function and social cognition. And autistic children who are, basically part of bilingual families or a bilingual society should not be discouraged from being bilingual themselves. The evidence supports this, and it actually encourages decisions more based on family dynamics, family preferences, and the child's language learning abilities. We should know that different environments, lab versus home versus school, can place different cognitive demands on autistic children. So your performance might look different from one environment to the next. That seems reasonable because different environments, will just basically involve maybe different duties, different demands. And so that's just something for us to keep in mind when you're interpreting the results. Just looking at the tool, how was this measured and what does this mean for this child's cognitive function? Finally, greater language proficiency, greater exposure to both languages, earlier age of language acquisition for both languages, and frequent language use and switching. These factors have been linked to improved cognitive outcomes for bilinguals. I have underlined greater exposure to both languages and frequent language use and switching as maybe like the two main ones, because from a theoretical perspective, as far as theories that have outlined the relationship between bilingualism and cognition, these are the two things that matter the most from a theoretical standpoint. Age of acquisition, definitely important, but then we also have many findings from the interface done with typically developing people that tell us that people even who learn a second language much later in life can still present with cognitive benefits if they're actively exposed to the language and actively engaged with the language. So these are the conclusions from my talk, and I want to thank you for taking the time to listening. I hope I managed to pull in some key points there for you, and I'm very happy to listen to your questions.
Great, thank you so much, Shireen. So we have a couple of questions that were sent in to us prior to the talk, but I'll start with the one that's in the Q&A. So they've said, can you please give more information about the multiple case series analysis and how was it done?
Yeah, okay, I'm just going to go back to that slide, just to have it pulled up here. So how was it done? Well, basically, we looked at each individual performance across the autistic group, and then we see how that relates to the average of the typically developing group. And so basically, if something is above a certain, standard deviation, so say if it's within one standard deviation, if an autistic person's performance is within one standard deviation of a typically developing average, then that person is really equal in terms of performance. But if it goes above that, for example, above, say, 2 standard deviations, sorry, terms are getting a bit technical now, but all the analysis is coming back to me. So if it goes up, above a certain threshold, then either you're performing worse than your typically developing peers, or actually even much better. So what I found is that most autistic children, when you analyze their performance relative to the average of the typically developing group, that mean, most of them performed equally to their typically developing peers, and some of them actually did much better than their typically developing peers. The problem at the end of the day is when we average performance across a group, that tells us nothing about the capabilities of each individual. It's not as meaningful. So we do need both. We do need to look at things on a, basically looking at the whole team, but at the same time, when we look at people individually, we just compared their performance on each and every single executive function domain, working memory, sustained attention, flexible switching, and interference control with the mean of the TD group. And then we see who is within that threshold and who was way above that and who was way below that.
Great, thank you, Shireen. And I'll have one more question, and that is a little more broad. And the question is, what do you think are going to be the priorities for future research in this area?
Yeah, that's a really cool question. Well, I mean, basically, I would like to draw on the points that I just mentioned here, saying that moving forward, the priority would be to be more diversified in terms of our inclusion criteria. So instead of looking at, a very specific group of autistic people, let's expand that a bit more so we can generalize the findings across the literature, and that way it can have more validity for you and for people also, at large. So basically more diversified samples, whether in terms of IQ, ethnicity, languages, to include multiple measures, to increase sample sizes, to look at things more longitudinally. And of course, most importantly, I think we have a problem with measures. A lot of the measures we use are mainly for typically developing children. They're not really designed with autistic people in mind. And that's where we can really benefit with, obviously collaborations with autistic people, more participatory research here to basically come up with the right kind of measures so that we can measure the same phenomenon, but with a different group. That's where the future should be, I think.
Great, thank you. Just to say to the people who have asked some really interesting questions, I have them saved and we'll be asking them to the panel at the end, so they will definitely be asked. But thank you so much. And we're next going to move on to the work of Katie. So Katie completed her PhD at the University of Cambridge, where she researched the experiences of children, families and educators when autism meets bilingualism. Katie is currently a lecturer in psychology and education at the University of Exeter, where she specialises in mental health and education settings. Before her PhD, Katie worked as a secondary school teacher in a modern foreign languages department, as a mentor for students with disabilities and mental health conditions, and a translation trainee at the European Parliament. So Katie's currently on maternity leave, and unfortunately, due to some technical difficulties with Teams, we aren't actually able to play the video she made for us. So Bérangère, who will actually be doing her own talk next, has kindly stepped up and is going to be presenting Katie's findings for her. But we will make sure that Katie's video is on the webinar website, so that you can watch that later at any time. So we won't be having questions specifically in this section, but again, we will absolutely be having them at the end, and our panel discussion will be a bit longer, so we'll make sure we'll get through as many as we can. Okay, Bérangère, when you're ready.
Hi, I hope you can all hear me. So I'm Bérangère, I'm the one who has been sending you all of these emails. So I'm the co-organizer of the event with Rachel. And as Rachel said, unfortunately, so Katie could not be with us today, but for a very good reason. She just gave birth and she's on maternity leave. And unfortunately, we can't play the video because of tech issues. So instead, I'm going to give the presentation. I want to insist that this entire presentation and all the words that I'm going to say, everything is prepared by Casey, and it's entirely her words that you're going to hear. I'm just saying them today. And I'm just going to switch I for she and my for her in the talk, but that's really the only difference. And as Rachel said, the talk will be made available online as well. So let's start. So this is the talk by Katie Howard, who works as a lecturer in education and psychology at the University of Exeter. And she's delighted to spend a little bit of time now on this topic, one language or two, lived experiences of bilingual children on the autism spectrum and their families. She would very much welcome any comments or questions, so please do feel free to contact her on the email address on the screen. Today's presentation on children's families and experiences of bilingualism in autism formed part of her doctoral work and was done in conjunction with the MATES project, that's Multilingualism Empowering Individuals Transforming Societies, the aim of which is to raise the profile of language learning and multilingualism in collaboration with a network of universities and non-higher education organisations across the UK. Her work was part of Strand 6 of the project, which considers the impact of multilingualism on cognition. And she wanted to thank her wonderful collaborators, Napoleon Katsos and Jenny Gibson, who also work on this important and interesting field of research. So the small body of literature on bilingualism and autism suggests that parents within bilingual or multilingual families are routinely advised to speak one language rather than the two or more available to them if their child is diagnosed with autism. Although well-intentioned advice, perhaps based on an assumption that language difficulties might be exacerbated by bilingualism, there is no evidence of detrimental effects of bilingualism in autism. In fact, researchers, including those presenting today, are tentatively suggesting that there may be social, linguistic, cultural, and perhaps even cognitive advantages of bilingualism for autistic individuals. With growing numbers of children speaking English as an additional language in the UK and an increase in autism diagnosis, the interaction between autism and bilingualism is inevitably on the rise. But what does this mean in practice for children and families? There is a need to gather the first-hand experiences of the children themselves, whose voices are too often neglected from the research. This is particularly important when we consider how frequently the communication rights of autistic children are compromised or ignored. As a result, this study sought to better understand the experiences of autistic bilingual children in mainstream schools in England and Wales using computer-assisted interviewing. Parents and educational practitioners were also consulted to find out whether there was joined-up thinking between children, parents, and schools when it comes to expectations and experiences of bilingualism in autism. As you can see, a wide range of languages and language backgrounds were included in this study, which sought to reflect the diverse linguistic makeup of the UK. In terms of the findings, bilingualism was highly valued by children and families for many reasons, including social relationships with family members, access to cultural heritage and identity, improved linguistic and social awareness, and some families even noted the positive effects that using the home language had on both parental and child well-being. Despite such positive reports, the benefits of maintaining the home language, around half of the families that they spoke to had decided to adopt a more monolingual approach to raising their child. So in this case, they had chosen to speak English rather than maintain the home language. What factors influenced these decisions? For the families who decided a more English-only approach, the driving factor was the severity of the child's autism. Some families felt that two languages would be too cognitively demanding for their child. In a similar vein, some families were concerned about their child's development of English and therefore decided that a more monolingual approach would be more suitable. Others made their decisions based on the advice given to them by professionals. And this was mixed with some clinicians suggesting that families stick to one language, while others advised them to maintain both languages. Then, for families who opted to maintain the home language and pursue bilingualism, it was communication with family members that emerged as the key determiner in their decision, whether that was communication with themselves as parents or with grandparents or extended family. Just to go into a little bit more depth on some of the findings, one interesting theme that emerged was that children educated in a more multilingual environment, where bilingualism was the norm, tended to hold much more positive views about being bilingual than those who were educated in more monolingual settings, who tended to downplay their bilingual status and stated a preference instead for English. The social and linguistic environment that children find themselves in does then play a huge role in children's own perceptions of how normal and how useful bilingualism might be. Next, in line with some of the parents' views, there were concerns expressed by a number of educators that the child may be disadvantaged by bilingualism in terms of the development of written and spoken English. So some educational practitioners perceived bilingualism not to be a possibility for certain autistic children they worked with. However, that said, what emerged from the family and children's data was that there were a series of negative consequences to only speaking English to an autistic child from a bilingual family. First, a number of parents who had opted for this route expressed regret or guilt of not passing their home language onto their child. They spoke about the impact this had on themselves and their relationship with their child. Others spoke of how this impacted the whole family, because non-autistic siblings also lost the opportunity to be bilingual as only English was spoken or used in the home. Other negative consequences included reduced relationships with extended family members and some concerns by parents that their own English language proficiency and their modeling of this was negatively affecting their child's fluency in English. Parents in Wales reported a lack of specialist educational provision through the medium of Welsh, which resulted in them having to make difficult educational choices. So they could choose an English medium specialist school and their child might lose their bilingualism or bilingual identity, or they could choose a Welsh medium mainstream school where the child would be able to develop as a bilingual, but then risk them not receiving the specialist support that they needed. In terms of summarizing these findings, it appeared that bilingualism was very much valued by children and families and tended to support family well-being. Although those who had continued with the bilingual approach said that in the short term it was a difficult option, many reported that it had yielded great benefits in the long term, and they were pleased with their decision, suggesting that families may need more time and support to maintain bilingualism for a child on the autism spectrum. This investment of time and support may very well be worth it. That said, decisions should be made in a case-by-case basis, as although bilingualism was beneficial and possible for many of the children, for some families and children, a monolingual English-only approach was considered the best course of action. Drawing these threads together, this research has some clear implications for policy and practice. First, it's important for the evidence about bilingualism and autism to be well communicated to families, enabling them to make the right choice for their child and wider family. Resources like We Speak Multi, which has been put together by colleagues at the University of Cambridge, provide useful information on bilingualism and activities that help parents make up their mind about what will work best for them. Second, there needs to be greater awareness about the possibility of being bilingual for autistic children, so the opportunities to speak and use their home language are not withdrawn too early or too quickly. Evidence of the benefits of bilingualism for autistic children should be outlined and disseminated to professionals working in education and healthcare, but equally should not be overstated. Thirdly, and finally, we call for stronger partnership to be established between education and health services so that a consistent message about the evidence around bilingualism and autism is given to families who are making difficult language decisions. Thank you so much for listening. Katie hopes that you are enjoying the rest of the webinar, and please do feel free to get in touch with her with comments or questions, as she would really love to hear from you. And these are some of the references for the work that Katie's used for her thesis.
Sorry, Berenger, I put you on early, but I've just had a really interesting comment that I thought actually kind of related to a wider question that you could definitely answer. So there's a comment that says, I'm shocked that clinicians are still advising that families should be monolingual. It's been written into the RCSLT guidelines for about 15 to 20 years that this should not be advised because there was no evidence for this and the potential negative consequences were clear. And I suppose a kind of one of our relevant questions to that was, so I work as a speech and language therapist. When an autistic child's language is slow to develop and their understanding of language is limited, should we still advise the families to use languages with the two languages with the child? I suppose I picked the two of those because they're kind of opposites, but it's still the same kind of, I think you probably advise the same thing.
Yeah, and I agree actually. So it's not, as I said, this is Katie's work, it's not mine, but it's true that to date and from the research available today, the fact that a child is slower at developing language is not a reason to not expose at least the child to bilingualism, and being exposed to bilingualism might just slow down a bit the development of language, but a slower language development is seen in bilingualism even with typically developing children. So I think that the main worry in autism is just that it adds one more layer of just slowing down a bit the development of language, but ultimately there's at least no evidence showing that any dramatic delay is due to bilingualism, and that bilingualism entirely blocks the development of language. So I would say that even if the child might have difficulty developing language, it's always positive. If there's some language and the child is happy to be exposed to two languages, then parents should just use whatever works best for them as a family, I would say.
Rachel is muted.
Rachel,
we're going to have Berenger talking about her own research now.
You are muted, Rachel.
I'm not muted now, am I?
Yes, I've unmuted you, sorry.
So hearing from Berenger talking about Berenger's research. So Berenger finished her PhD in psychiatry at the University of Edinburgh, and she researched how bilingualism shapes the social life, social cognitive skills and brain activity of autistic bilingual people. Her research really stands out in the field because she focuses on autistic adults, and she uses a multidisciplinary approach. So she's currently working as the engagement officer at the Patrick Wild Centre, which conducts research on autism, Fragile X and learning disabilities at the University of Edinburgh. So I will put her on now. Over to you, Berenger.
So hello again, but this time to talk about my work. So yes, my name is Berenger and I work at the Patrick Wild Centre. That's also where I did my PhD. And while the other talks today focus more on childhood, this one will actually look at adulthood. In this talk, bilingualism as lived, how bilingualism shapes the life and social skills of autistic adults. So as the other presenters talked about earlier, most of the research available in the field of autism and bilingualism actually focuses on experiences of parents or practitioners. But the data that looks at actual autistic bilingual people, most of it is done for childhood. And in all of these studies, it's mostly looking at language development, showing no additional language delay due to bilingualism, but also looks at overall autism symptoms, and a few studies, even more now, a lot of them done actually in our team, look at overall mental skills in autistic bilingual children. However, these autistic bilingual children do grow up to become autistic bilingual adults. And it turns out that there's actually very little data on autistic bilingual adults. The few studies that exist are actually just case studies of polyglot savants, so people who speak like 10 languages. And these studies mostly look at their language skills. So when it comes to adulthood, there's actually not much out there. There's nothing on their lived experiences, their overall cognitive profiles, or their neurological profile. And that's what I was interested in for my PhD, focusing in particular on social cognition, which, as you know, can be particularly problematic in autism. So that was what my PhD was about. I wanted to look at the effect of bilingualism on social cognition every step of the way, from the social life habits and lived experiences, then to the social cognitive skills, focusing on perspective taking, which I will tell you a bit more about in a minute, and then down to the brain networks supporting perspective taking processes. So for the first step, the lived experiences and the social life habits, my first question was, how do autistic people become bilingual? Because in the research out there, there's only two populations that are represented, either children who are growing up in bilingual families or adult polyglots. But is it really representative of the overall autistic bilingual population? And then I wanted to see whether bilingualism could shape the social life of autistic people, and if so, how? So to answer these questions, I designed the Autism and Bilingualism Census, which is an online demographic, language, and social life quality questionnaire. So there's two papers published from that questionnaire that you can read more about. There's one that is published in Autism, and there's one that is currently in press for Autism in Adulthood. And so for this questionnaire, I gathered data from 297 respondents. So that was 89 monolinguals as a control group, 98 bilinguals, and 110 multilinguals autistic people. And so how do autistic people become bilingual? Well, in so many different ways. So this is just 3 different variables of the bilingualism experience: the age of acquisition of the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th languages, the average proficiency in these languages, and the environments where they learned these languages. And with each red dot representing one individual participant, you can see that there is a huge diversity of language profiles in the autistic population. And there is a great diversity in terms of how many languages they can speak, when and where they acquire these languages, and how proficient they can be in these languages. So what we can see here is that any story you can think about of how somebody could become bilingual can be the story of a neurotypical person, just like it can be the story of an autistic person. So then I wanted to see if being bilingual changed something about their social life. So for that, I ran a lot of regression models, and I found that actually, yes, bilingualism shaped the self-rated social life quality of these autistic adults, and that actually the number of languages categorized as 1, 2, or 3 and more was predictive of their self-rated social life quality score. With the more languages they reported, the more satisfied they were with their social life. So obviously that doesn't mean that the more languages they knew, the happier they were. To me, it just hints that there was indeed something going on between bilingualism and social processes in autism, which then led me on to my next question, looking at social cognitive skills. Because indeed, so there is some data in typical development that bilingualism stimulates the development of perspective taking. However, when we look at these questions in adulthood, findings are kind of, well, they don't always agree with each other. The problems with these studies is that they always consider bilingualism as just a binary thing, so bilingual versus monolingual, when actually in reality, bilingualism is so many different things, and the bilingual effect can be shaped by so many different features of bilingualism, like the number of languages they know, their proficiency in the languages, when they learn the languages. And also, when you look at some social cognitive process like perspective taking, actually there is a range of modalities of perspective taking, like so perspective taking, it is the cognitive process when you take the perspective of somebody else. This can be done visually, like what does the other person see? The cognitive perspective taking, what does the other person think? Or affective, what does the other person feel? So my question was really, what is it about bilingualism that shapes and perspective taking abilities in typical development and in autism? And to answer this question, I gathered 96 neurotypical bilingual adults and 39 autistic bilingual adults. And I conducted a battery of cognitive assessment and language history measures. And then I ran a lot of regression models again. And what did I find? Well, in the neurotypical adult sample, I found that indeed bilingualism stimulated perspective-taking abilities, especially in the more social modalities, cognitive and affective, understanding what other people think and feel. And I found that actually this effect of bilingualism was driven by the age of acquisition of the second language. The younger they had learned their second language, the better they were at doing perspective taking. And I found this effect even though in my sample, it just happened that all my participants had acquired their second language before age 15, so quite a small range of variation, but still it showed that that effect of the age of acquisition of L2 very strongly in childhood. So the bottom line here is that there seems to be that early bilingualism seems to stimulate the development of perspective taking in childhood in a long-lasting way because it was still visible in an adult population. And what did I find in autism? Exactly the same thing. Again, I found that the earlier they had acquired their L2, their second language, the higher they performed on perspective taking, especially in the very social theory of mind modalities. Even though, again, in this sample, all the participants had acquired their second language before the age of 15, that was still enough to show these effects of the age of acquisition of the second language in childhood. So the bottom line here was that early bilingualism seems to stimulate the development of perspective taking, a social cognitive process, a complex one, in autism as it does in typical developments in a long-lasting way, because this is an effect from childhood exposure to bilingualism that is still seen in an adult population. So the summary here is that we see a huge diversity of language experiences in autism, and that bilingualism indeed seems to shape the social life quality of autistic bilingual people. We see as well a long-lasting developmental effect of bilingualism, and this effect seems to be similar in typical development and in autism. And I didn't present the neurological data here, but again, in my adult sample, I found that there were neuroactivity differences between early and late bilinguals when they are doing social cognitive tasks, and that indeed, again, this difference, this effect of early bilingualism was similar between the neurotypical group and the autistic group. But I want to leave you actually on the real life testimony of my participants. In the first study, when I was trying to understand who autistic bilingual people were, I also asked them some open-ended questions about how being bilingual had shaped their life as an autistic person, and how being autistic had shaped their life as a bilingual person. And this is what they said. They talked about how autism had influenced their language learning, that it could be both an advantage and a disadvantage when it comes to learning languages. They talked about all the opportunities brought by languages in terms of entertainment, leisure, travel opportunities, higher education, employment. They talked about the relationships that they were able to strengthen or build thanks to their languages. And they spontaneously talked about this sense of increased self-efficacy, of being more comfortable in social interactions, being more self-confident, and also increased autism awareness. And these are some of their quotes. Bilingualism is useful to understand others and to perceive reality through different perspectives. And I really like that this participant mentioned perspectives without knowing that I was working on perspective taking. Somebody else said bilingualism is great to be able to communicate online with people about ourselves and our autism. It makes you feel less alone. And finally, each language I know allows me to better express specific thoughts and emotions. And I find that these quotes really show how, for these respondents, bilingualism had helped them to better understand themselves and others. So thank you for your attention. If you were interested in this work, if you want to know more about the work done at the Patrick Wild Center, feel free to sign up to the Patrick Wild Center database for updates and also to possibly take part in future studies with professionals. And I want to thank my supervisors, Sue Fletcher-Whitson, Andy Stanfield, and Antonella Sorace for their guidance during my project, and also all of the participants who took part in this work. Thank you.
Thank you, Beranger. So I'm just going to ask one question before we move on to Drasko, and then we'll have the final questions at the end. But we've just had a question that I think you can answer now, which was, I wonder why being bilingual stimulates perspective taking. Could you talk about, the potential theories behind that?
Yeah, so there are many different theories as to why we observe that, at least already in neurotypical children. And there seems to be maybe something that is very metacognitive about that, knowing that when the child grows up, it learns actually very early on, at a very young age, that there is one language that they can use with one person and another language that they can only use with another person, and they cannot use their other language, the second language, with that one person. So they very early on understand that not everybody has access to the same information about the world, which is something that in typical monolingual development, children acquire slightly later on. And this understanding is the basis of perspective taking, the ability to know what somebody else thinks. And so this is one possibility, though Shireen also talked about executive functions. Perspective taking relies heavily on executive functions, so possibly bilingualism, by stimulating very early on in development executive skills, then this allows also some benefits on the skills that rely on executive skills, like social cognition.
Thank you very much, Beranger. Okay, so moving swiftly on, I'm going to introduce Drasko Castellan. So Drasko is a linguist whose research is focused on bilingualism, cognition, figurative language, and autism. His other areas of interest include code switching, language development, and language impairment. Currently, he's based at the University of Leeds, where he's working on developing a questionnaire for quantifying bilingual experience in children as part of the QBEX project. So I'll pass you over to Drasko now. Sorry, Drasko, I think you're muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, perfect.
Great. Apologies for any inconvenience, first of all. So today I'm going to present a quantifying bilingualism questionnaire that we worked on within our team. And even though this event is about autism and bilingualism, just a disclosure that this tool is not necessarily built for people with autism, but we hope that clinicians or practitioners can use it for any sorts of bilinguals, no matter the condition they have. And I would also like to thank and acknowledge all the members of this team who are led by Professor Cecile Decat, whose hard work and contributions I'm about to present. So I'm briefly going to talk about a Delphi consensus survey, which we use to inform our questionnaire, and also show you the outline of the tool that we built. I'm going to focus briefly or shortly on the exposure and use modules, on the language assessment module, and on the module assessing risk factors. And finally, I'm going to outline how this tool could be of use to practitioners. So one of the uses of the Delphi method is to explore and achieve consensus for any research topics where there has been a lot of work done, but where there is no really agreement of how things are to be done. And one of those topics is how to quantify bilingualism or bilingual experience in children. So how Delphi works is that stakeholders or experts in the field get a series of statements. For example, language mixing should be quantified when assessing bilingualism, and they express their agreement or disagreement with them. And if a group of people or panelists and stakeholders pass a certain threshold, we can say that those statements reached a consensus. So we were interested in 3 stakeholder groups, in researchers, in SLTs, and in teachers, and in terms of the needs that they have as a group when quantifying bilingualism. And we were also, of course, interested in what aspects of bilingual experience should be documented. So we ran a Delphi consensus survey, and if you're interested in the details about the study, you can access the preprint on the link in the right corner or by following the QR code. But just briefly here, we ran 2 rounds of the online survey, and they were completed by 132 stakeholders from 29 countries, and we ended up reaching consensus on 98 statements. So we used these 98 statements from the Delphi survey We also conducted a review of the existing questionnaires to quantify bilingualism. We looked at the psychometric literature for advice, but we also incorporated some of the best practice when it comes to bilingualism questionnaires, such as PABIC and ALE questionnaires, or at least certain parts of them that were relevant. And from all of this, we devised QBAC's questionnaire, which looks like this. So the tool has 8 modules. The background information module, then modules about language exposure and language use, which are actually merged into one module. After that, we have questions about the language assessment, about richness of linguistic experience, or as we also call it, the quality of input, of language input that the child receives. There are also questions about attitudes, about language mixing, and finally about risk factors. Currently, we are working with Castlegate IT, who are optimizing the tool. So the questionnaire will be freely available to everyone and it will be distributed online. There are some customizability options. So you can decide to distribute the tool either to the caregivers of bilingual kids, or if kids are teenagers, so slightly older, you can also distribute it to kids themselves. I assume that for practitioners, the caregiver version will be the more relevant one as you work with younger kids. You can also choose the language of administration. The tool can be used with bilinguals and trilinguals. And of course, you don't have to distribute all 8 modules. So you can pick and choose the modules that are of interest to you for the kids that you work with. And we expect to have the final version of the questionnaire available for use by August of this year. Now, I will just briefly illustrate some of the modules, the ones that are kind of framed here in the list. So for language exposure and use, this is an example question from the caregiver version, and it is a case of a trilingual kid. So the question asks caregivers to think about a typical week in the current year, and when the child is with friends in the local community, but not at school and not at home, how often do these friends use each of the language when speaking to the child? And on the left side, we see the 3 languages that the caregiver indicated for the child, that the child speaks. So English, Croatian, and Italian, and we see sliders for each language in the middle. The caregivers can then move the sliders, indicating either less or more of each language. And as the sliders move, the pie chart on the right updates. So they get a visual impression of what they're reporting, essentially. What the tool does, in this way, we avoid asking them about percentages and asking them to answer these questions by using quite vague labels such as always, sometimes, often, which mean different things to different people. But the platform transforms these pie charts into percentages. So using the percentages from several questions of this kind about different contexts and interlocutors, the platform automatically calculates the following scores. So we get an estimate of exposure and use to each language for the current year of child's life. Then the cumulative estimates of exposure and use, which means estimates for the whole life of the child, and something that we call weighted exposure and use. This is essentially a current exposure and use measure, but kind of more refined and adjusted for the time that the child spends in each context or with each interlocutor. When it comes to the language assessment module, there are questions about proficiency assessment with no comparison group and proficiency with a comparison group. So the child is compared to other bilinguals and multilinguals in the country. So in the first part, the parents are asked to generally assess the speaking, understanding, reading and writing skills of their own child. And in the second part, they're asked to assess their kids' speaking, understanding skills, as well as the ability to make correct sentences or understand sentences, but they're asked to think how their child performs in these in comparison to other bilinguals in their country. Obviously, these are no direct measures, and as we also reach in a Delphi consensus survey, it is always best to administer direct measures of skills to the kid. However, this is not always possible because there are not always standard tests for all the languages or people who speak those languages so they can administer to the kids. Therefore, this module is there rather as a backup plan. Finally, for the risk factors module, we ask questions about the age of first words of the child, of the first sentences, and also we ask about any concerns that the parents might have had about child's language development before the age of 4. It is important to note that in Delphi, we also agreed that it is important to have these risk factors noted down. However, this is not a diagnostic tool, so if these questions point to any red flags, a more detailed and standardized assessment would be necessary. So for customizability, there are several modules here. As I pointed out before, you can essentially, I don't have time to go in all the details here, but as we said before, you can pick and choose either particular modules, or for certain modules, you can choose some subsections of the questions. So we have quite a lot going on here to go into detail for a short talk. You can administer the tool online. The idea is that you can create a link, send it to the parents, they fill it in, and even before you see the kid in practice, you can get kind of a report or assessment of the kid about their bilingual background. As I mentioned before, you can choose the number of modules to administer, language of administration, and it can be used with bilinguals and trilinguals. And what you get from the tool after caregivers fill in the questionnaire is a report in English, which can be used in your kind of other assessment of the kid. For now, initially, we plan to make the questionnaire available in these 14 languages. However, we have already received volunteers for some additional languages, which you see on the side. The ones that are underlined are already work in progress in terms of translation, but we are sure that with the research community that we have and the move towards open science, we will probably have even more languages than listed here, which is great news. There are some limitations with the tool, unfortunately, that we have to acknowledge. So the tool is administered online, and it's still not adapted for a paper version or as an interview protocol. This will likely affect caregivers with low or non-existing literacy skills, or those who are not apt to use technology or don't have access to computers and the internet. Unfortunately, this means that those with the lowest SES status, with lowest socioeconomic background, will be maybe hit the hardest in terms of not being able to use this tool. But we hope that any follow-up project that comes after our 3-year project will address these issues and do relevant adaptations so that we can actually make it available to everyone. If you're interested in the updates about our project, you can follow this link or the QR code or write to us, and I would like to thank you for your attention.
Great, thank you so much, Drasko. That was brilliant. Just to kind of push on due to time, I'm going to actually just move on to the panel discussion, but I will ask you the first question. So we're welcoming back all our previous speakers that will answer the remaining questions, and we'll also hopefully be joined by Sunny Hallett. So Sunny is the co-founder and mental health advisor of Amaze, which is the Autistic Mutual Aid Society Edinburgh. They're also a trainee counsellor and autistic advocate, so it'll be really great to hear from them too. But Drasko first. So the first question I have for you is, I'm wondering if a child being bilingual, or at least being exposed to 2 different languages, for those who have language difficulties as well, could make it more difficult to identify autism.
Right. So there is no general answer to this question. I mean, each child's language profile is quite different, and we can't say that it's easy to acquire one language, even not to mention 2 languages. What we do know from the literature now is that there is no negative evidence of bilingualism in terms of autistic population. So we know that when we compare bilinguals with autism and monolinguals with autism, there is really no difference in terms of development. How hard it is to actually recognize it, or how bilingualism can affect the diagnosis of autism, this, I guess it's a big problem, but this is mostly because, as some of the attendees already know, is there is a certain milestones in bilinguals are different than in monolinguals, and often that can be confused with language delay. However, there is a lot of research trying to kind of disentangle these factors. Nevertheless, just to highlight again, as far as we know, there are no negative consequences of bilingualism, so it shouldn't be a reason for concern.
Great, thank you. Now on to Shireen. I should just remind our speakers to wave at me if you have a point to add after I've asked the question to the first speaker. So Shireen, you have a question about your talk specifically. So when you talk about the benefit of language exposure and being actively engaged with language, could you explain what you mean by that?
Yeah, so basically, you being exposed to more than one language, that can take place in the home, that can take place in a school environment, or just take place at large. So getting exposed to a language could either be passive exposure or it could be active exposure. Passive exposure is just like me sitting here talking to you, and then two people are just around the corner, for example, just like speaking another language that I don't speak. I'm not actively, exposed to that language. It's not being said to me. They're just two people speaking separately. That's more passive, and that's less to do with theoretical considerations regarding the impact of bilingualism on cognition. Those theories tend to focus on active exposure with the language. So, I'm being actively exposed to the languages that I know or want to know in a direct way. It's being said to me. I'm hearing it directly versus, at the same time. So that's as far as exposure is concerned. We have active versus passive, and the active is the way to go from theoretical and also the practical sense. The other one, I believe, sorry, Rachel, did you mention proficiency? Or did you mention language use? Frequent use, yes, frequent use with the language. And so that's basically, using both of your languages in whatever proficiency you may have, but on a frequent basis, maybe with the same person or with different people, just staying actively engaged with the language, whether it's speaking the language, reading the language, listening to the language, interacting with someone in that language. So these two have the greatest theoretical relevance as far as the impact of bilingualism on cognition, and that's really been brought out by the findings. So that's what they mean.
Brilliant, thank you. Unless anyone else has anything to add, Bérangère, you will have the next question. So the question is, I feel like the question to address is more whether or not children with significant language delay should continue to be exposed to multiple languages rather than children with autism. So more about delay than autism. Often the age of typical language acquisition is before a child's being given a diagnosis of autism. I would agree with other comments that most early years practitioners like SLTs, paediatricians, etc., are not advising families to stick to one language in the context of autism, although this pattern may be different in the context of significant developmental delay. What does the research say about this in general?
I'm not entirely sure there is a lot of research done, especially on that. For overall language delay, I don't know if Drasko knows more about this than I do. Overall, I would say that the findings are generally that if the child is happy to be exposed to bilingualism, then why not continue? While obviously if it becomes too draining for the family functioning, then there's no point to continue either. But then if it's, let's say that bilingualism will not normally, there's no data on showing that bilingualism would completely prevent any development of language. So it might just take more time, but it would not actually prevent it. So I don't know if Drasko wants to add something to that, maybe yes.
Yeah, you're quite right. The research in this area is quite emerging, and another thing that as I'm sure everyone knows, is quite complicated is that it is often more than one condition that we're talking about. It's not that kids always have only autism or only DLD, for example. But because the research in this area is emerging, we can't for sure say these are the answers and a recipe for every single kid, because the level of language difficulties will be different in every kid and in every condition. What we know is that language difficulties that appear in autism, or in some kids in autism, are different from the language difficulties that appear in DLD. So we definitely need more research in this area, but again, it is important to highlight that just deciding not to raise the kid bilingually because of a certain condition and have that advice or that recipe, so as to say, for all kids would be quite detrimental, because there are other factors that come into play here. Essentially, if we cut out one language of the child's life, we are, in some cases of heritage language speakers, cutting out a whole part of a family from their life who wouldn't be able to communicate with them in any other language. And that can have detrimental effects on child's development in so many other respects. So yeah, I think the short answer is we definitely need more research to disentangle these things, but for now, we don't really have negative evidence of bilingualism.
Great, thank you. Just to say, I know we're at time now, but I think we are going to go on for about 10 more minutes just because we have so many great questions. So please stay if you can. And my next question is to Sunny. Welcome, Sunny. I have introduced you already, so my first question for you is kind of in your own experience growing up with two languages, was there one specific thing about growing up bilingually as an autistic child that was particularly challenging, or alternatively, thinking about it the other way, was there kind of anything that was kind of not difficult at all and maybe seemed easy?
Hi. Yeah, so I think growing up as a as a bilingual autistic kid, obviously I didn't know that I was autistic at the time. I think the one thing that struck me was that I had a lot more capacity for, a lot more potential rather for playfulness with language growing up with two languages. And I think that's one thing that obviously not all autistic people, but many autistic people who sort of, use language that, are quite appreciate a sort of playfulness and, kind of investigating what literal meanings are. And that's something that I think with bilingualism, I had this kind of, I was able to sort of really play with language, and people kind of gave me more space to do that as well, because they were sort of like, well, we don't really know what the expectations are for this kid because they knew another language. I think I don't really know about difficulties because obviously I don't have an alternative experience. I suppose when I was very young, I did have some difficulties with knowing when it was sort of, what language to use where. But I would say that was not necessarily different from other kids. And if anything, I maybe gained an awareness more quickly that, say if I used Chinese on the London Underground, then I could probably say some really rude things about people and no one except my dad would understand. So, I mean, this kind of ties in a bit with sort of Béranger's sort of work on perspective taking, of course.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like that's kind of a really interesting point that I suppose within this research, aside from Béranger's, we don't really actually hear that much about personal experiences and kind of anecdotal stories like that actually go with the kind of cognitive research that people are running. So it's really great to actually hear those kind of, that we're not just looking at something that's going on in a home visit that we, see people for an hour or two. So that's great. Thank you very much. Okay, Shireen. I had a question. So I'm interested that you mentioned decisions to encourage bilingualism should be based on child's language learning abilities on one of your slides. This is a question I'm often asked as an SLT by parents, whether their children are significantly delayed with vocabulary and language development or have developmental language disorder within their autism diagnosis. When should or shouldn't we be encouraging continued use of 2 or more languages, or just focusing on one? Parents seem to want to reduce, understandably, but I still recommend both. What does the evidence say? So we have touched on this, but I think it's just a really important question to kind of go over again.
Well, I mean, to begin with, I just want to highlight that aside from this specific group of children that you are talking about, generally speaking, even when there are delays with typically developing children and also other groups, we see that they tend to catch up. And usually that is like by late primary school or so. And again, that might look different for other children. They might need even more time with that. But I think as long as the child is showing an interest in the language, and as long as they're using it in some capacity, so it might not be the capacity that you wished for. Maybe you were hoping they make more progress by now, and they're not, but they're still engaged with the language. You know, they respond to this language. They sometimes use this language. Then I really don't see a need to discourage that child from continuing their learning in that language, especially as we know what's at stake here. There has been no evidence to suggest that bilingualism will be detrimental to the point that will, you know, exacerbate any existing delays that people have, that the particular groups of kids do experience. And so based on the evidence, based on the child's preferences, based on their abilities, you know, they're basically like using it in some ability, some capacity, and based on the dynamics of the family, I think that's what should inform things moving forward. And so if those things are in place, why not? Particularly considering what's at stake if you actually stop that language.
Yeah, absolutely. Beranger, I think you had something to add.
Yes, like in this conversation of maybe stopping to use the home language, at least for a little while until the child's language abilities develop. Like one thing also that has to be considered is that in the context of autism, it's important to remember that many autistic children are very into sameness and having routines that are clear and that they understand and that they can relate to. And in this context, if suddenly, let's imagine that the whole family moves on to speaking only one language, so the majority language for a few years until the child's language abilities develop and settle, and then to reinstall the second language later on in childhood. In the context of autism and the importance of sameness for the child and for the child to be comfortable and to be to feel safe, it can actually go very badly to suddenly have one parent switching language for no reason when the child has not been used to that. So while the attitude of adding another language later on in childhood can definitely work for some developmental conditions and some language conditions, in the specific context of autism, it might not always work, and it might not be a safe option to then suddenly later in life in the life of the child just change one of the language of the home.
Mm-hmm. I think this is kind of a vaguely related question. I'll ask you, Drasko. If the parents have been speaking only English to their child for years, even though it's not the parent's first language, is it too late for you to advise that they start talking to their child in their first language only or in addition? A lot of 4 or 5-year-olds come into the clinic in this situation, and the parents have broken English. Oh. I think you're muted again, sorry.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
So yeah, I guess that this is as for the UK context. I would say that living in the UK, it would be important or a much better option for parents to use their first language with the child whenever they can, because this is essentially the home environment is often for kids in the UK, for bilingual kids in the UK, the only place where they can get exposure or interaction in the language other than English. So I would advise for them, if they haven't started from child's birth, to switch to that language as soon as possible. But one of the things that we sometimes forget about in research or when we talk about these things is, as I think it was mentioned before by Shireen, is that also there is the child side, right? So if the child is not, children can sometimes show reluctance to languages for whatever social reasons. So if the child is willing, I think that the parents should definitely use their first language as much as they can, because in the UK context, the kid is likely not going to get input in that language at all. But yeah, it also depends on the child, I guess. Especially with older kids, teenagers sometimes in particular can have unwillingness for a lot of social reasons why they don't want to use their heritage language or first language.
Thank you. Again, a kind of related, just a follow-on very short question, but I think the answer is no, but there might be some. Has there been any research in how the parent's proficiency in English impacts on the child's development in English? For example, switching languages versus only speaking another language other than English. To my knowledge, right. I'm not sure, but perhaps you know of any research in this area.
Switching languages is, I think, linked to another myth about bilingualism, that switching languages is bad. But from what we know about a lot of studies, either experimental or naturalistic studies about language switching, is that it often shows a high proficiency. It's a sign of high proficiency in bilinguals or of high proficiency in bilingualism in general. So yeah, we know from research that languages, depending on their mode, get differentiated quite early on in child's mind, and language mixing is not causing any problem. It just shows yet another feature of their bilingualism. So I don't think that it would cause a problem. On the other hand, when it comes to something that was maybe asked as a part of a question before about parents who speak to their kids in English, and even though English is not even though they're not fully proficient in English, this is something that is an interesting question, because more and more research is turning now towards the quality of the input that the kids get, and we seem to have some findings indicating that the quality of the child's input are important. So this would be an additional piece of evidence to suggest to parents that they stick to their stronger language, which likely will be in the UK context their heritage language, rather than force English if English is not fully proficient in the parents.
Thank you. I know we're running out of time, but I have one more question for Sunny, and then we just have a last point. So, Sunny, autism and bilingualism research links kind of more broadly to, a wider lack of understanding of autism in some families and some communities, and a lack of diversity in research more generally. What are some of the steps we can take as researchers to increase understanding of autism, but in a meaningful way, and ensuring we're asking the right questions and we have the right priorities for autistic people?
So I think a really sort of obvious and important step, and I would argue that this step is sort of vital for all autism-related research, is that autistic people are included in a meaningful way. So by which I mean sort of ideally as paid advisors and consultants, if not actually autistic researchers themselves. So I think there's a responsibility amongst all non-autistic autism researchers to be good allies and to be sort of encouraging and helping autistic people to become researchers if they want to, if that's sort of areas that, where we can start to look at priorities within our own community, the autistic community. I think that, a lot of what has been touched on, I think, has been around sort of, what is the best thing to do for an autistic child or for somebody growing up. And like a lot of the stuff around bilingualism and whether somebody should, be taught one language or, both of their home languages. And it is very kind of similar to a lot of other kind of discussions around autism where, a lot of it's viewed from the outside. And sometimes when a problem is viewed from the outside, the solution is not, the solutions that people come up with are not appropriate. So it really has to be around kind of being informed by what are autistic people's experiences of bilingualism. Also, what are our experiences of, being made to learn one language and the confusion around that, for example. I think it's understandable that somebody might look at a population who struggles with communication and say, oh, well, let's not add to that by bringing in another language. But actually, that's a misunderstanding that comes from a lack of sort of empathy, actually, and an attempt at understanding where our community's perspective comes from.
Absolutely. I think so far the research is prioritizing kind of cognitive benefits or the potential for, detrimental things. But the thing is, even, we can say very clearly there don't seem to be detrimental effects of autism. But regardless of the you know, whether there are cognitive benefits or not. To me, it seems much more important to say, does the child want to speak that language? Do they feel more involved with their family? Do they feel more together as a family? And are they involved more, you know, in cultural identity and their communities? And if so, even if there were some small detrimental effect on X, Y, Z, you know, it shouldn't just be taken into account on its own, like cognitive strengths and difficulties. It should be a much bigger picture where incorporating kind of whole person perspective and choice, which sounds so terrible that it's not that obvious, but I think it's something that we absolutely need to start prioritizing as researchers as well. I could go on talking all day. We have so many more questions, but I think we're going to have to leave it there. One of the questions actually said, would you recommend any family multilingual resources to direct families to regarding assisting them with making an informed decision that's right for them, which is good timing as that's what we're planning on doing ourselves. So I'm just going to pass you on to Bérangère, who's just going to tell you a little bit about our post-webinar information.
Yes, so this is the closing slide. So thank you for attending, and actually you will see in this post-webinar form that we would be very grateful if you could complete it, that actually there's a section at the end where we talk about the fact that we would like to take this conversation further and actually take all of the things we've discussed today and all of your questions and your doubts and your concerns and actually create resources for practitioners and for families and parents of autistic bilingual children. So these two types of resources, we really want to create that, but we need to create that with you because you're the ones who know the resources that you need to guide parents. So in this form, at the end, you will find a section where you can register your interest to join a sort of small working group that would take only, we think, like about 3 hours, split in 2 sessions, where we can review what sort of resources would work, and then review the resources that have been created, the first draft. And this is because we know that practitioners need these resources that they can give to parents, but also just to their colleagues. And so we want to create that for you and with you. So in this questionnaire, feel free to register your interest at the bottom of the page. Know that this webinar has been recorded, and we will make the recording available online on our website with the transcription, and the Katie's talk as well that I just had to give will also be put on the website so that you can have the talk from Katie's perspective. And I think that's it for us. Thank you so much for attending. We were so amazed by the amount of support that we received for this webinar. We really thought originally that only a handful of people would want to attend. So we were just so happy that so many of you were interested in this topic. I also want to thank our supporters, so the Patrick Boyle Centre, the Salveson Mindroom Research Centre, and the Bilingualism Matters, and the University of Edinburgh overall. And I also want to thank our speakers, so Shireen Sharan, Katie Howard, who is not here today, Darasco, I can't even say your last name, I'm sorry, because I have a terrible name as well, and Sonny as well, Sonny Hallett, who joined us for the Q&A. I also want to thank the helpers who supported us during this this webinar, so Nicole, Maria, and Susan, and then you as well for attending. And thank you so much, everybody. Goodbye. Thank you.